Um, well, again, thanks everybody, and we sure appreciate on behalf of a lot of different folks whose names I will briefly share with you in the next slide. We really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this symposium, and we're really enjoying learning about the Northwest risk and the whole risk concept. There's going to be at least one key slide in a little bit that I'm going to try to remember to just nod to Tom Kay's presentation, some interesting ideas about trying to get out in front of the need for plant materials, whether they're locally sourced or this whole admixture idea. That's an important idea for us in the sagebrush arena, of course. And then I also want to nod to Gregor's talk. It's really clear to me that the RAD framework is additive in this whole sagebrush ecosystems conversation, and the kinds of frameworks that are used in sagebrush country are very much in alignment with RAD type thinking. So there's a lot of opportunity here to grow this stuff forward. What I want to do is focus on the action part of this challenge, and sort of emphasize kind of almost the way the sausage is made, if you will, the process working within an organization like the National Park Service and trying to move a variety of different players and actors together. And to that end, as you might imagine, such an aspiration is sort of an all hands on deck type of an aspiration. And accordingly, we have a lot of folks here. There's more people that I could name. We represent many parks and different programs and divisions within the Park Service, and then of course a lot of collaborators and neighbors from outside the agency as well. The Park Service stewards about 10% or so of the overall federal protected area sagebrush footprint. Not necessarily large by, let's say, BLM standards, but meaningful, and particularly when you think about our overarching shared goals. With a little parenthetical nod again to Gregor's talk, that our preserve and protect for future generations mission does sort of need and is often sort of reinterpreted in real time in the present era of heightened awareness of accelerated change. But regardless, it's clear that the Park Service can and needs to make a real concerted effort in service of the broader kind of national goals and aspirations that we collectively have about sagebrush conservation, sagebrush ecosystem conservation. And there's a lot of potential nodes on what would be is a very highly distributed network. We've got many parks where there's substantial amounts of sagebrush land cover, and so there's much that we can do there. But of course, the problem is that, as is the case broadly, we're experiencing accelerated rates of fire-driven loss, and oftentimes post-fire, over time, these landscapes make a substantial and sort of positively reinforced transition into annual grasslands, as is sort of exhibited by this one photo on the right. A case in point is that just last week, Lava Beds National Monument burned again, which is the second time in 2 years. And Lava Beds is in Northern California on the Modoc Plateau, kind of adjacent to the Great Basin. It's one of our important sagebrush steppe parks. So it speaks to the urgency of the problem and the challenge of trying to get ahead of this pace of change. So arguably then status quo is not working, or at least won't really serve going forward into this brave new future that we're embarking on. So what's our capacity to change status quo? And to some extent, what do I mean by status quo? In this case, what I want to emphasize is the over-dispersed nature of the organization, that the Park Service is inherently challenged in a way because we have all these different parks with different enabling legislations and histories, priorities, incentives. So it's a bit of a herding cats challenge at times. But there's real opportunity with this also. And so I'll try to elaborate a little bit on what that looks like, again, kind of in a grassroots sort of bottom-up way. And so what seems to be increasingly clear here is as important as the sort of understanding of scientific uncertainty is and will continue to be. I think of the more fundamental challenge for us right now is just harnessing our organizational capacity and moving in new and creative and more effective ways together. So specifically, I think we need to really seek out and develop and build these sort of linked opportunities. I'm kind of borrowing from the structured decision-making conversations here, and then catalyze around what might, at least superficially, appear to be unaffiliated activities. You know, one park's restoration project from another. They're often they're not in line of sight. We're not necessarily always leveraging and sharing lessons learned and resources and capacity in the best ways. So there's kind of a new way of doing business, but within the same organizational structure that we have to work within. We've had some, albeit modest, success. We've learned collectively as a group in different ways in different places. So one place where we've had some exciting recent linked opportunities is at Big Hole National Battlefield in southwestern Montana, which is not necessarily a park you think of as being a sagebrush park per se. It's rather small. It's a cultural landscape, but the cultural landscape is also a sagebrush landscape, as it turns out. And so there have been some neat ways to knit these things together, these sort of aspirations of managing the cultural landscape for those kinds of goals, and then also pursuing more biological conservation or natural resource type goals. What's been interesting is to see how much the fire program, both prescribed fire and wildfire response activities and those programs have been the nexus around which we've been able to knit together these cultural and natural resource goals. We had a real-time test of this summer, yet another fire, the Trail Creek fire, barreling down on the park. You can see Big Hole National Battlefield on the eastern flank of the perimeter on this InsaWeb map. This was just a few days ago still, so it's actually still active. But back in July, there was a moment in which it was time to take some action to protect infrastructure and check the fire spread out into the valley. And so backfiring tactics were employed, but and that in and of itself isn't particularly novel, but what this took on much more weight and importance because it was really informed by really a decade or so of science and support and collaboration. We had resource advisors on scene from the Forest Service and the Park Service who were all kind of playing together on the same script here. And so it was, for me, watching through the lens of the Big Hole Battlefield webcam, a really cool example of how with a high degree of intra and interagency coordination and communication, we really could allow these sort of linked opportunities to percolate up from the bottom, almost like an emergent property when you're alert to them and you're seeking them out. And so this was kind of a, as I said, modest but cool example of how this kind of thing can happen on the ground. And as I noted, we have science support behind this to kind of help inform in a real-time way and update and iterate these kinds of decisions. In this case, we've been following spotted knapweed and lemhi penstemon populations for a while within the context of different stressors and interventions. So we think we're doing okay, at least as far as this information stream or data stream is suggesting. We'll see what the next few years hold. And of course, this will have to be updated after that Trail Creek fire. One of the things that we've done, which we felt was very creative and seems to be successful, is just the simple act of finding hand cans of Roundup and giving those to our monitoring crews to spot spray knapweed while they're moving around doing lemhi penstemon monitoring. And that appears to be successful. We've been doing that now for a number of years. So shifting to a really different place, in the John Day Fossil Beds National Monument in Central Oregon, it's a low, hot, much less resilient to fire, much less resistant to annual grass invasion type of a sagebrush bunchgrass steppe relative to a high cold valley like Big Hole National Battlefield. So here, there's a very different story in terms of how prescribed fire is or isn't a good idea, as a matter of fact. So we've had a lot of fire in the landscape, both prescribed and unplanned ignitions. We've had a lot of fire science to follow how those how the plant communities respond to that. And as you might imagine, in this case, we've really documented very much a rapid exacerbated rate of annual grass invasion, not just cheatgrass, but here Medusa head. Turns out this is a spectacular park for studying Medusa head. And then even more recently now, we've gotten into vent nada as well, which actually was somewhat of an ecological surprise given how dry this park is, and our sort of priors about vent nada being a species that was going to do better in kind of moister, more mesic sites. But nonetheless, there it is. But we have also teased out some other interesting nuances. So rather than just documenting this inexorable loss to annual grassland conversion, we found that there, of course, as you might imagine, in a very topographically rugged landscape, the topography plays a key role here. And so really it's a rather simple and somewhat intuitive insight, but it's cool to quantify it using empirical methods and then provide that to strategic conservation. And that, I think, begins to get us back into kind of RAD type thinking, where we realize that we have the information now available to us to begin to identify where, in a very kind of judicious way, where we might direct some aspects of the landscape, where we're going to have to accept or triage some portions of the landscape, where we can perhaps resist or hold the line in some places, at least for the near term. So we've taken that kind of information, built some statistical models to support decisions, and then baked those into a variety of strategic plans. I can't claim that we've really been able to put those plans into practice on the ground really a little bit, but we're getting there, and I think the foundation is set. So again, it's sort of like, well, the next few years will really be telling. Right now, we're updating the fire management plan to really bring all this stuff together. One example, one new linked opportunity that I wanted to highlight that is really cool, and I think it really exemplifies that unaffiliated, what could have been a missed opportunity, or just something else that the park is doing, and you would think you wouldn't necessarily knit these together in terms of sagebrush conservation. And that has to do with initially a problem with irrigation diversion and fish passage. Park is collaborating with the Confederated Tribes of Warm Springs on this. And then there's like a downstream linked opportunity that arises when we realize that this is going to force a change in the irrigation, and then the hayfield management that the park has grown hay as part of its historic district for many decades. It looks like now maybe what we're going to be able to do is see a shift towards native plant propagation, and that is the kind of the nexus with Tom's presentation just a moment ago about recognizing that we really need to seek ways to start to support the sourcing of plant materials to deal with things like post-fire restoration. And currently we're behind the curve on that, I think, as an agency, at least in many of these parks. So here suddenly we have a new, what again could have been seen as an unaffiliated opportunity sort of pop up. So we grab these when we can. My third and final example is just to showcase how we're trying to support parks to really kind of get out in front and take a more proactive stance now, capitalizing on decades of science, the kinds of things that John Bradford spoke about yesterday. We've used his products and some of his colleagues' products quite a bit. Now recently pulling together predictive models and maps of where resilience is likely to hold up or where it's not, trying to think about how to pull together different fire behavior models or fire risk maps if we can get them, and make those easy to use for parks, really thinking about these geospatial toolkits to support the kind of RAD type thinking and planning that needs to happen now. So I think this is the kind of example of where we can start to put the D into play in terms of RAD type work. And we've told this story recently. We had through a story map, so I'd direct you to that. We had a graduate student, Jamila Thompson from Utah State University. She did a great job as an intern this summer for the Park Service. And this story map, we directly, our target audience are the park managers, the decision makers, the folks trying to deal with this challenge in sagebrush landscapes in parks. And so we've tried to encourage them to think proactively and try to be part of this collective conversation. So I'll stop now, even though there's a whole lot more to this whole thing that we could say, and maybe with Q&A we'll get to it. But I just wanted to finish where we start, albeit with a more concise title, reiterate this kind of need to build lateral flow of information and capacity among what we might have thought of under status quo type conditions as formerly siloed efforts, and use strategically shared goals and conceptual frameworks to knit these unaffiliated activities together better. I'm really intrigued by thinking like the Wayne Gretzky analogy, looking at John Bradford's paper from a few years ago on anticipatory conservation. Wayne Gretzky, of course, was that famous hockey player who was really good at skating into the open space and anticipating where the hockey puck was going to be. And I think that analogy speaks well to what we really need to try to do as an organization now and what we're trying to enable. Clearly, the RAD framework has a key role here for us, and there's sort of sagebrush ways of talking about this. There's, like I said, it's an additive framework that certainly fits well within existing frameworks about resilience and resistance that we're already using in sagebrush country. And so we have a springboard, and we can really accelerate, I think, the movement in this direction. My final slide here is, I was tinkering with this just the other day while I was putting these slides together, and I thought this is kind of fun. I'm calling it my "we can do it" diagram, just to kind of highlight and almost celebrate the amount of investments that have been made collectively for decades by the entire community of practice, but specifically within these sagebrush parks and within the Park Service. There's been quite a learning and capacity building curve. So we're in a much better place now to be proactive with an eye towards improved outcomes. And what I would say is that hopefully with this kind of preparation and some good timing, we can really generate our own luck. Call it serendipity, but luck is fun too. We're going to need it, and so we'll see what happens. But that's sort of where we are right now, and so I'll stop there. And if there's any time, I'll take questions.